first of all, what is capitalism? One thing to understand is that it was actually a negative term developed by communists like Marx because they wanted to imply that capitalism was just for the rich, for the people with saving and investment. In other words, which is what capital is. It's the people who invest money, and the Marxists, the communists, wanted to imply that capitalism was a system that only benefited the so-called robber barons, the rich industrialists of the 1800s. But in reality, capitalism is just a term for what I would call free markets or free enterprise or economic liberty. And the principles of that system, first, is self-ownership. You own yourself and your labor, and you can use your labor and your brain to earn income, to accumulate property, to build wealth, and you do that in a system based on voluntary exchange and market prices, and you compete with other people in this system. And most economists, when they're talking about capitalism, yes, capital is part of capitalism, but labor is an equally important part. These are the two factors of production, and capital and labor get mixed together in ways that generate more economic output in a free enterprise system. And in that free enterprise system, yes, there is a role for government, mostly to protect life, liberty, and property. That's what most libertarians and small government supporters would favor. So government should protect against foreign invasion, protect against crime, enforce contracts, and arbitrate disputes. So there is a role for government in what are called public goods. These are things that, in theory, the private sector can't provide. That's what capitalism and free markets are, but it's very important to understand that it's not just profit that defines free markets or capitalism. Profit is a good thing, but only if earned by honest competition. And a lot of people get very confused about this in the United States, where we have businesses that go to the government and they want subsidies, they want protectionism, they want bailouts, they want special favors that cause the playing field not to be level. In other words, they don't want the rules to be fair. They want the government to tilt the rules in the favor of certain businesses. And a lot of people think, oh, those capitalists, they're being greedy. But no, that's not free enterprise. That's cronyism. When politicians get in bed with big business, that's the opposite of free enterprise. And so it's very important to understand that in a free market system, people are pursuing profits, but that's only good if they're pursuing profits without the government trying to give them some sort of special unfair advantage. Well, now let's talk about what socialism is. So a lot of people think socialism just means big government, but that's not technically true. Socialism has a very specific meaning in economics. It refers to a system based on government ownership and control of the means of production. Well, what is means of production? It means government-owned factories. It means collective farms. It means the government has control of what's called the commanding heights of the economy. It also means central planning, where you have some politicians and bureaucrats in this socialist system where they own the factories, they own the farms, they own the businesses, and they decide, well, should we build more factories to make this? Should we create more businesses to sell that? Do we increase wheat production, or do we have more apple orchards? Central planning means industrial policy for the entire economy. It means politicians and bureaucrats are deciding what gets done, when it gets done. And of course, when they have all that power, they also have to set government prices. Because if the government is owning everything and selling everything and running everything, they also have to determine the prices. In other words, it's not competition that determines whether something sells for a high price or a low price. It's the decisions of bureaucrats at some planning committee in the national capital that make those choices. Now, this technical socialism, true socialism, is not very common. It did exist in the Soviet bloc, at least to a great extent, where you did have collective farms and government-owned factories and planned economies and government set prices. And it still exists to some degree, actually to a large degree, in places like North Korea and Cuba, and to a lesser extent in places like Venezuela. But in democratic systems, this is the final bullet point on this screen. Really, the only example of a democratic country that actually tried real socialism was the United Kingdom after World War II, when they did nationalize industries like airlines and power and railroads and healthcare and things like that. But that system wound up failing in the United Kingdom, and Margaret Thatcher privatized many of those industries. So now the airlines and all sorts of other industries, power industries, they're now privately run companies. So there are a few examples of true socialism, but they tend to only exist in communist dictatorships. Now, having just said that, I should point out that communism does mean socialism, but socialism does not mean communism. Remember, communism involves totalitarian dictatorship, and they do have socialist economic systems. But as I just indicated with the example of the United Kingdom after World War II, you can have socialism without a dictatorship. It's just very rare. Again, the United Kingdom is the only country I can think of actually had socialism in a meaningful sense without having a dictatorship. And I suppose let me digress for a second here. When you're talking about the real world, there's always a spectrum or a continuum of possibilities. So even in the Soviet Union or even in North Korea today, there's always some little parts of the economy where free markets are allowed. And even in free market economies, if you were to look at Singapore today, there would be some examples where government is playing a role in the economy. So we're really talking about, nations where the preponderance of economic activity is controlled by government compared to nations where most economic activity is governed by free enterprise. So we're simplifying here by acting as if it's an either or choice. In reality, you're looking at a wide spectrum where governments might be free market in one area, but they might be socialistic in another area. Now let's get to what I think is going to be the key important point for my presentation, which is that redistributionism or transferism is not the same as socialism. And this is really where the debate in most nations is now focused. Countries like the United States, like France, where I assume Pierre is, Germany, Japan, all over the world, Australia, nations are free market oriented. As you can see on the bottom of the screen, they have privately owned businesses, they have market-based prices, you have private decisions governing what factories are being built, what businesses are being opened, but they have large welfare states. They have lots of redistribution programs, which in many cases are for old people from working age people. In other cases, it's redistribution from rich people to poor people. These welfare states, that's where the modern economic policy battle is mostly being fought. Should welfare states be bigger? Should they be smaller? But that, I want to stress, is not socialism. Yes, socialism is big government, but you can also have big government simply through a very large tax and transfer welfare state. And as I said, this markets versus redistributionism. This is where I think the battle, well, it's certainly where the battle is in the United States. And in following economic policy around the world, I think it's accurate to say this is where most countries are now fighting. You very rarely, if you look at the left-wing parties in most nations, very rarely are they saying, we want the government to take over companies and run the companies. That system failed so badly in the Soviet bloc, and it's failing so badly in places like Cuba and North Korea. Even very left-wing parties usually are not in favor of that. Now, again, In some countries, there are some exceptions. Some countries have government-run power companies. Some countries have government-run railroads and things like that. But in terms of the bulk of the economy, uh, I think it's safe to say that there's a consensus that the private sector should run most companies, run most businesses, allow markets to set prices and determine the allocation of resources. But the left says, okay, we'll allow markets, but we want to impose very heavy taxes to fund a very big welfare state.